Forensic science begins at the end of someone else's story. Scrutinizing a violent moment in time. Samples are collected and preserved. The scene exhaustively photographed. Evidence prepared for forensic experts to examine. Television and movies fuel blind faith in the power of crime scene investigations, or CSI. But since the emergence of DNA analysis, a disturbing trend has emerged. DNA, pulled from evidence that spent decades gathering dust, has revealed a surprising number of wrongful convictions. In fact, in hundreds of exoneration cases, DNA did more than free the innocent. It proved that the forensic evidence that convicted them was wrong. It's time to put CSI on trial, to find out what's real science, what has scientific potential, and what's just junk. The stakes couldn't be higher.
My name is David Camm. I was wrongfully convicted of murders of my wife, Kim, my 7-year-old son, Brad, and my 5-year-old daughter, Jill. And this is my story.
Get everybody out here to my house now! Okay, all right. My wife and my kids are dead!
On September 28, 2000, former Indiana State Trooper David Camm was playing basketball at his local church. Around 9:30 p.m., he makes the short drive home to the house he shares with his wife Kim and kids Jill and Bradley. Kim's black Ford Bronco is in the garage as usual. But everything else is horribly wrong.
Dave? Get everybody out here to my house now! Okay, all right. My wife and my kids are dead! They're dead! Everything should be okay, all right? We're gonna get everything. Everything's not okay. Get everybody out here now! They're coming.
35-year-old Kimberly Camm is lying on the garage floor in a pool of her own blood. Both Jill and Bradley are shot to death in the back seat of the truck. An unimaginable tragedy. Police descend on the grisly scene to try to put the pieces together. What they find will shake David Camm's world for a second time. The investigation turns on this evidence: David Camm's t-shirt stained with blood. High-velocity impact spatter in the parlance of blood pattern analysis, or BPA. When the shirt is tested, 8 spots are identified as Jill Camm's blood.
Basically, what they were saying was that these dots meant that David Camm was within 3 feet of his daughter Jill when she was murdered.
Travis Kircher, a reporter in Louisville, Kentucky, just over the river from where the crime occurred, covered the Camm case.
They're arguing that the bullet, when it hit Jill, her blood spattered backward and pulverized, which made it so small that it hit his shirt in this pattern of these tiny dots.
Detectives tell David that science was driving the investigation.
That it is high-velocity blood spatter. It's scientific documentation. The only way that comes on is from blowback or blowout from a gunshot.
And I knew that whoever this person was, that they were wrong. And I'm telling them, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong. I did not do this. He says you've got high velocity impact spatter on your shirt. That means you had to be there. I don't care who your expert is. He's wrong.
"72 hours after the crime, David is arrested. Bloodstain pattern analysts study the size, shape, and distribution of bloodstains at a crime scene. They match patterns made by blood left behind to those they've seen in the past. Working backwards from the aftermath, they attempt to decode the sequence of events, the weapon used, and even the culprit.
Some of these stains are like, a tenth to a hundredth of a millimeter in diameter. And
Stuart James is a bloodstain pattern analyst and crime scene reconstructionist.
you can see clearly that
He also wrote the textbook, or one of them, on BPA.
we have three categories. We've got passive bloodstains, we have spatter bloodstains, and we have altered bloodstains. The more energy is produced to produce a pattern, the smaller the stains get. Spatter stains can be as small as less than a hundredth of a millimeter.
Anita Zanin is an independent forensic analyst who specializes in BPA. Recreating blood spatter from a gunshot, she demonstrates how different variables impact the size of the droplets.
The caliber and the ammunition make a huge difference. So these patterns are 6 inches away from the blood source. This is the back spatter, which comes back towards the shooter.
Back spatter on clothing can implicate a suspect. According to police, the back spatter on David Camm's t-shirt was proof that he pulled the trigger. 14 months after being charged with the murders of his wife and children, his trial began in Floyd County, Indiana.
So I went from being a husband and a father to being accused of the murders. It's just, there's no way to describe what the experience was like.
The state built their entire case around blood spatter. On the day of the crime, they'd called longtime BPA practitioner Rod Englert to the scene, but he was busy and sent his protege, Robert Stites, in his place.
He went through the scene and everything to do with the crimes, and based upon his conclusions of the things that he saw, a probable cause affidavit was put together, with the majority of it coming from his analysis of the scene and various things associated with it, including my shirt. And based on that, I was arrested.
When the prosecution brought Rob Stites out, you could tell that they were really kind of saying this, he's a big witness.
Both Stites and Englert testified at the trial.
It's the type of pattern you would expect to see only if this particular garment is within the zone of the backspatter that was created in that explosive scene in that one moment in the shot to Jill Camm.
Englert also opined that blood on Camm's shoe indicated he shot his wife, Kim. But David Camm had an alibi, a solid one. 10 witnesses who all testified that Camm was with them at church playing basketball. prosecution countered with an implausible scenario.
They alleged that I had left the basketball gym and the other 10 basketball players, driven home, murdered my family, got in my vehicle, driven back to the gym with blood on my shirt, and went back in and started playing again.
None of the basketball players saw Dave leave, noticed him missing, or saw blood on his shirt or shoe.
They all testified there was no blood on Dave. I had no blood on me.
His vehicle was also clean.
There's none. There's no blood anywhere in my truck.
And there was no motive. David was painted as a bad guy for having had a series of extramarital affairs. Between that and the BPA, the jury was convinced. On March 17, 2002, they returned a verdict: guilty. David was sentenced to 195 years in prison.
You think in the very beginning, this is the United States of America. We value freedom, we value liberty. We supposedly have the greatest justice system in the world. You find out that all that's bullshit at some point in time while you're locked in that cell.
For the first 6 months, he held out hope.
I mean, every time I heard that door pop or keys rattling outside that door, I thought to myself, this is gonna be the time. This is gonna be the moment. They figured it out. They know it wasn't me. They've actually solved the crime. I mean, all these thoughts go through your mind, and over a period of time, you realize that it's going to have to run its course, and then you just hope that at some point in time, God intervenes.
Camm had been waiting for divine intervention for 2 years when his verdict was overturned because of prejudicial testimony unrelated to the forensic evidence. New information about an old piece of evidence would alter the course of the second trial. The night David Camm's family was murdered, a gray, prison-issued sweatshirt was swept into Bradley Camm's body bag. Written on the inside of the collar, the word backbone. But the prosecution marginalized its importance. Richard Kamen, an Indianapolis-based criminal defense attorney, represented Camm.
David was questioned about it by the police, not his. His defense lawyer at the time asked, they did DNA testing on it to see whose DNA it was.
It's got like 7 numbers written on it. And it also has the name Backbone written on the inside of the collar.
A Department of Corrections ID number, practically a business card, left at the scene.
The notion of a stranger's sweatshirt being in that garage is not happenstance. And it was evidence that they discounted because it didn't fit their theory. So the defense lawyer asked the prosecutor to run the DNA from that sweatshirt through CODIS, the DNA database. The prosecutor a month later said that was done and that there was no results.
For David's second trial, the defense requested that they try again for a hit in CODIS.
And it came back to Charles Bonnet.
Charles Backbone Bonnet, a recent parolee who had been serving time for abducting 3 female undergrads.
And because he'd been in prison, his DNA was in the database. It was revealed that the first prosecutor had never sent it to CODIS. He had lied to the defense. Had that been done, Bonnet would have surfaced before the first trial.
And we always knew the sweatshirt was the key because it was alien to my home and the scene.
A palm print on the side of Kim Camm's Bronco also matched to Bonet, as did another puzzling clue.
One of the things that even the detectives originally said that made no sense is why Mrs. Camm's shoes were put very neatly on top of the car.
It was a calling card for Bonet, whose admitted foot fetish had earned him the moniker the Shoe Bandit in previous crimes. But incredibly, instead of releasing David, the state revamps their theory. This time, Camm and Bonet planned and executed the murders together. Bonet gave a number of conflicting statements before implicating Camm while being interrogated by the police.
It was, tell us how you helped David Camm kill his family. And he was smart enough to understand this was what they wanted to hear.
The reason why I was there was to bring up that night.
As a former state trooper, David Camm saw this as a symptom of a systemic issue.
Law enforcement, prosecutors, they just cannot admit that when they're wrong, because it's more important to them to maintain the presumptions that the general public have for the integrity and the character of the folks that sit in those positions.
Blood spatter experts who testified at the first trial also stuck to their guns that David was involved.
Essentially, these same experts who had said in the first trial this murder was committed by one person acting alone looked at the jury and said, 2 people did this, and I can tell that 2 people did this.
In March 2006, both David Camm and Charles Bonet were found guilty. Camm spent another 3 years in prison. And then, for a second time, his conviction was overturned. In his third trial, his defense team systematically dismantled the state's case. Robert Stites, the protege sent by Rod Englert to the crime scene, was forced to admit he perjured himself when he claimed to be a crime scene reconstructionist and college professor working on a PhD in fluid dynamics. All of those credentials were made up. Next, they went after the analysis itself.
In any law case, experts tend to beget experts.
Stuart James testified on behalf of the defense.
What this turned out to be was it looked like an annual meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Each side had 5 experts on the same issue.
A large part of that trial was bloodstain pattern analysis experts arguing back and forth, what are these dots? What do they mean?
The state maintained that the blood spots on Camm's shirt were there because he was the shooter.
The defense is arguing that no, it's not what happened at all. David Camm leaned over his daughter after he came home and found his family dead. He leans over his daughter Jill to try to resuscitate his son, and the tips of her bloody hair basically impact his shirt straight on.
The spots of blood were exhaustively examined.
I can remember hours of experts on either side arguing that, look at those microscopic dots. Are they in the weave of the shirt? Because if they're in the weave, that meant that they hit the shirt with strong velocity. It had to imprint them into the weave of the shirt. If they're on top of the weave, then that means that, well, the shirt could have contacted Jill's bloody hair, and that would be surface impact.
But the properties of the textile itself, David's t-shirt, were ignored.
When we spoke to the experts and said, okay, what's the effect of the fact that the shirt is cotton and polyester? They looked at us like we had three heads because they had never thought about this.
The surface upon which the blood lands is hugely important. Without taking that into account, pretty much the rest of the conclusions are useless.
And the spatter itself was microscopic.
2 or 3 stains are really not enough to call something an impact spatter from gunshot that's going to put someone in prison the rest of their life.
The jury deliberated for 10 hours. David Camm was found not guilty on all counts.
One of the blessings of my career was having the opportunity to represent David. I think it really needs to be said over and over and over again. This is not a close case. David Camm was innocent. He spent 13 years as an innocent man in prison. And there simply shouldn't be any question in anybody's mind about that.
The state was blinded by their faith in bloodstain pattern analysis. They ignored exonerating evidence, an alibi confirmed by 10 witnesses, the sweatshirt, the handprint, the shoes, in favor of the 8 tiny specks of blood. But perhaps more alarmingly, we now know that despite 3 trials and countless experts, the BPA analysis was wrong. As an exoneree and former police officer, David Camm's perspective is perhaps unique in the world.
I think it's a fine investigative tool for law enforcement to use to try to decipher what has happened within a crime scene, but it's not a hard science, and you have to keep in mind, there's a good possibility you could be wrong.
Throughout this whole so-called discipline there's these tenets that have never been subjected to any real scientific scrutiny. The notion of high-velocity impact spatter, how far can these droplets really fly? What's the effect of gravity? What's the effect of wind on microscopic droplets?
You have the different densities of the blood versus the air that can help set up what are called instabilities. You have drag. You'll have surface tension.
Nicole Sharp is a scientist who actually has a PhD specializing in fluid dynamics.
Blood is a complex fluid because it has plasma, it has proteins, it has white blood cells, it has red blood cells, and each of these things helps it behave a little differently, sometimes a little strangely, compared to what our kind of instinct is with something like water.
This equation calculates the trajectory of a group of droplets flying backwards from an impact, backspatter, like those the prosecution said landed on David Camm's shirt. An unsolvable equation because some of the variables are unknowable.
We don't have all of the possible information that we need to do the problem fully.
Nicole assumes the best intentions for why bloodstain pattern analysis and fluid dynamics have been on different tracks.
Forensic scientists have had murders to solve all this time and haven't been able to wait for fluid dynamics to catch up. So in a lot of cases, they've made assumptions and simplifications that they felt helped them get to answers.
But were those assumptions and simplifications leading to the wrong answers? In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences released a highly critical report on the status of forensic science. It includes a section on BPA that says, "The uncertainties associated with bloodstain pattern analysis are enormous." It found that forensic disciplines were not supported by rigorous research to validate their basic premises. Practitioners pushed back, saying that the report undervalued their field experience. But most BPA practitioners today are not trained scientists. Many are police personnel who have earned a certificate from a week-long workshop. But lack of experience may only be part of a larger issue.
This is a problem in some forensic sciences where most experts are trained and experienced, but where the methods used haven't been subjected to rigorous scientific testing.
Jay Kohler is a law professor with a PhD in behavioral sciences who researches criminal forensics.
The requisite testing wasn't done because the courts didn't require it to be done. Forensic scientists have been welcomed into court for 100 years in some cases because the leading forensic professionals assured the courts that they could do what they said they could do.
The few studies that do exist have revealed troubling inconsistencies. A 2016 study on the reliability of blood pattern matching on fabrics revealed that analysts were incorrect 23% of the time. Another study revealed that analysts could only tell which direction bloodstains were swiped, left, right, up, or down, accurately 68% of the time. And in 2015, 2 years after David Camm's exoneration, a research paper warned that bloodstains on textiles are not reliable because the fabric may interact with, distort, and alter the stain in many different ways. BPA didn't start in academia or even a federal crime lab, but in the Corning, New York basement of Herbert McDonnell.
The legend has it, I don't know if this is true or not, is that in order to run something approaching experiments, he shot a bunch of dogs.
That rumor is true, or at least McDonnell himself confirmed it. His initial interest was fueled by the notorious case that inspired the movie The Fugitive.
The case that stands out for the recognition of BPA was the Sam Shepard case in 1955. And he was accused of beating his wife to death in her bed at their house. He was also having an affair with his laboratory analyst at the time, so everything, as far as the police are concerned, was fitting into him committing this homicide.
At trial, a BPA expert testified Mr. Shepard couldn't have committed the crime because he was right-handed. McDonnell founded the Laboratory of Forensic Science and named himself its director. Few realized the humble scale of the operation, and in 1971, he secured a grant from the Department of Justice.
He taught the first basic course in bloodstain pattern analysis down in Jackson, Mississippi. He also created a small textbook and a laboratory manual.
Soon, he was teaching the basics of BPA to police departments across the country, advertising no minimum educational requirements needed to be accepted into the class.
And Herb became involved in many famous cases over the years.
He testified in the Gene Harris Scarsdale Diet Doctor case and in the O.J. Simpson case. Judges were impressed. So were juries. But defense attorneys began appealing cases, saying that his damning testimony was not scientific.
When you get beyond the very basics, at least in my view, in my experience, there's just no science to it. It's very much a made-up discipline.
McDonald defended his analysis as reliable to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty.
This phrase, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, is kind of a bogus phrase. It doesn't really have any meaning. That's just a misleading way of saying, in my opinion, here's what I think, has happened.
The courts, however, were convinced. In 5 states, the earliest court decisions that cite BPA refer to McDonald's expert testimony.
The law is a system that's built on precedent, right?
Kate Judson is the executive director for the Center for Integrity in Forensic Sciences.
So anytime you have precedent of something being admitted or of a conviction being premised on something, it becomes really, really difficult to unseat.
BPA testimony from hundreds of McDonald's students went on to set precedent in 13 more states. Within a decade, it was widely accepted in U.S. courtrooms. How did it go so far, so fast?
I think that the majority of people who contribute to bad science coming into the courtroom are doing so because they're really trying to be right. I mean, they want the right result. They want to make sure that guilty people go to prison and innocent people go free. And they just are working within a system that doesn't have the quality assurances it should have.
If the road to hell is paved with good intentions, all the street signs make you think you are going in the right direction.
So somebody comes up with a forensic technique, invents it in their basement, and they're told, oh, you helped put away this horrific murderer or this, terrible attacker, or this rapist or something like that, right? They're told that, and then that becomes this positive feedback that becomes very powerful in their mind, and they start to believe that the reason why justice was achieved in a particular case is because of the forensic analysis, and sometimes that's just not true. The folks who come up with these techniques are getting this feedback that might have absolutely nothing to do at all with the technique that they've developed.
The higher the profile of the case, the brighter this positive feedback loop burns. In 1980, in Australia, it was blood spatter on the dash of the Chamberlain family car that was used to convict Mother Lindy of the ritual sacrifice of her baby daughter, Azaria, while on a family camping trip. Like David Camm's t-shirt, the stains in the car influenced the entire investigation.
Very often in wrongful conviction cases, is the authorities get tunnel vision. They either filter the evidence through a prism of guilt, or more likely, discount or marginalize the evidence that doesn't support their theory.
The BPA analysis in the Chamberlain case was also wrong. Azaria was actually taken by a wild dog, a dingo. Shockingly, the spatter stain in question wasn't blood at all, but remnants of a spilled drink, alongside some material left over from the vehicle's manufacture. It was only decades later, when a search party looking for a missing hiker discovered the baby's knitted jacket near a dingo lair, that Lindy was fully cleared. Other cases tell similar stories. A small-town high school principal from Texas spent 32 years in prison for the 1985 murder of his wife. Like David Camm, Joe Bryan had an ironclad alibi, but was convicted based on BPA. He wasn't released until 2020. In Indiana, single mother and PhD student Julie Ray was wrongfully convicted of killing her 10-year-old son in 2002. Despite defensive wounds from battling the actual killer, BPA evidence on her nightgown, presented by Rod Englert, the same analyst that testified against David Camm, was central to the verdict. She was exonerated in 2006.
There's a lot of misconception about what forensic science can and cannot do.
In the 2000s, the public's faith in forensic science skyrocketed as millions of viewers began tuning in each week to a slick TV franchise that made crime science sexy.
It was everywhere. There's a reason CSI was one of the top-rated shows at that time, because this was all new.
It reinforced the idea that CSI was scientific and infallible.
It was almost instructive, and I think everybody felt like they knew about forensic science, and they wanted that. They demanded that of their prosecutors. I want that evidence.
The CSI effect is a phenomenon that refers to the impact these shows have had on the legal system.
The expectations are pretty high.
One man's faith in CSI may be the reason he is in prison today. Christopher Vaughn was once the successful father of 3 young children. He and his wife lived such a picture-perfect life in suburban Chicago that their home was written up in a local magazine. Today, he is in prison, serving 4 life sentences. Bloodstain pattern analysis was central to his conviction. His case has been picked up by a nonprofit advocacy organization.
I'm Bill Clutter, and I direct a national organization of private investigators called Investigating Innocence.
It was 2007 when Vaughn's 34-year-old wife, Kimberly, and their 3 children, Abigail, 12, Cassandra, 11, and Blake, who was 8 years old, were found shot to death in their SUV.
This was a case where the family is on their way to a water park from Oswego, Illinois. They were going to drive about 3 hours down to Springfield, Illinois. There was a popular water park, Knights Action Park.
Kimberly Vaughn was taking 2 prescriptions to help manage debilitating migraine headaches, but she still wasn't feeling well.
When his wife was feeling nauseous on the drive, he pulls over, pulls into a frontage road and parks.
"15 minutes later, Christopher is picked up by a concerned driver near the frontage road, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds. First responders on the scene found Kimberly in the passenger seat with an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake were found still seatbelted in the back seat. Each had been shot 2 times. Christopher was taken to the hospital, then, still in his hospital gown, interrogated for the next 14 hours. He said he couldn't remember what happened.
If you had to guess as to what happened out there, you're just a guess. This is what you're saying, what I think may have happened out there.
I don't think she's capable of that.
Okay.
She shot me. So shot the kids. I can't imagine her doing that. I don't know.
The police couldn't imagine it either.
Look at this! You can't look at it? What the happened?
And Christopher was charged with 4 counts of murder. The state's theory was that Christopher Vaughn got out of the car, walked around to the front passenger window, and shot his wife, then leaned in to shoot each of his 3 children.
The ballistic trajectory that clearly showed that one of the shots that had killed the middle child seated in the back seat had been fired from the passenger seat where Kimberly Vaughn was seated.
Prosecutors argue he then shot himself, once in the left arm and once in the upper left thigh.
It passed right over his groin area. If that shot had been maybe a half an inch lower, he probably wouldn't have been charged because no man would self-inflict in that location.
The prosecution said that he must have forgotten to stage the scene to make it look like a murder-suicide until after he self-inflicted his wounds and was bleeding. That would explain the BPA evidence. Chris's blood on the passenger side seatbelt buckle, deposited, they claimed, when he unbuckled Kimberly's seatbelt and planted the gun.
The way it was portrayed at trial was that these bloodstain patterns that belonged to Chris was proof and evidence that he committed the murders.
The jury took less than an hour to convict Vaughn of murdering his wife and his 3 children. He has now been in prison for nearly 15 years. But recently, in a letter to his parents, he made a major admission. He remembered what happened that day all along. He just couldn't face it. Sharing the public's confidence in CSI, Christopher assumed investigators would put the pieces together correctly. Once he became a suspect, he was afraid to admit he had been untruthful. He writes that he'd pulled over because Kim felt ill. He gets out and walks behind the car to make sure the car top carrier hadn't come loose. Then hears what he thinks are fireworks coming from inside the car. He runs back to the driver's side door.
His wife had a gun pointed to his head. He gestures that he raised his left arm, and that's a defensive wound. There was a second shot.
Kim looked at me and said, "You'll not take my kids, you killed them." She then turned the gun on herself and fired. I got back in to check the kids. Nothing could be done. I thought to drive the truck. Kim was slumped, so I tried to buckle her. My hands shook badly. I couldn't drive the truck. I got to the road to get help.
For this demonstration, you've been shot twice.
Bill Clutter uses a crime scene reconstruction to test Christopher's account.
Okay.
Chris describes closing his eyes and taking his uninjured right hand, reaching and trying to grab the strap of his wife's seatbelt. He's trying to buckle her in to drive away, and he couldn't get the seatbelt buckled. The recreation was completely consistent with the large saturation stain that you see on the seatbelt.
It's also consistent with Christopher's blood on the seatbelt buckle. So the same bloodstains can tell a completely different story.
The pitfall of bloodstain interpretations is, you can fall into that trap of seeing what you want to see.
What happened to the Vaughn family is an unthinkable tragedy by any measure. But it may have been a preventable one. Real, established science provides an important piece of evidence supporting the theory that Kimberly Vaughn was the shooter. Clinical trials have shown that the medicine she was taking for her migraines can increase the risk of suicidality, as well as psychiatric and behavioral disturbances. Clutter's reconstruction reveals that the blood pattern analysis that convicted Vaughn was incorrect, or at best inconclusive. So should BPA be presented in the courtroom as scientific? And if it isn't scientific, should the jury even hear it? The American criminal justice system does have a standard in place to keep unproven science out of the courtroom. The U.S. Supreme Court assigned judges to be the gatekeepers for scientific expert witnesses. Through evidentiary hearings, judges are supposed to evaluate the forensic science and rule on whether or not a jury should hear it.
You hear, all too often from defense lawyers that they filed a strong motion and the judge told them to let the jury sort it out, and that's not how the system is supposed to work.
The judge is supposed to use a rule of evidence, it's called Rule 702, where they require that all of the testimony that the expert provides must be reliable. And how do we know it's reliable? Well, everything needs to be backed by sufficient facts and data. And if there aren't sufficient facts and data to support what the expert is saying, the jury shouldn't hear it.
It's a systemic issue with a steep price tag. For David Camm's case, it took 3 trials to set the record straight, costing the taxpayers $4.5 million and nearly bankrupting the county. Testimony from forensic experts can mean the difference between a person's freedom and imprisonment, or quite literally between life and death.
I think it's really dangerous when people use the trappings of science to give a level of authority to an idea that doesn't necessarily have any scientific merit.
Scientists and scholars in the field of law agree that BPA shouldn't be presented as irrefutable science.
What the science tells us over and over again is that those tools are not reliable. And you can't have a fair trial with evidence that's faulty or false.
If you've got 3 people on one side and 3 people on the other saying exactly the opposite as 3 people on the other, you're basically into a coin toss. And that's not science. That's just a guess.
For wrongly convicted people, the wheels of justice move slowly, if at all. Christopher Vaughn hopes that the new evidence will lead to clemency. Until then, he remains a prisoner. As for David Camm, today he focuses on the future. He works for his family's business and has remarried. But the trauma can't be undone.
It's an impossible situation to describe, and it is an impossible situation to be in. When you're crying out from the depths of your soul and telling people that you're innocent, and one of them to recognize, that this is my family I lost, there's no way to describe that.